I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 10, Sunday, May 5th, 2024. The lesson is entitled Healing and Forgiveness. Lesson text comes from Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Related scriptures are Matthew 9, 2 through 8, Luke 5, 18 through 26. The place is Capernaum. The time is 28 AD. Healing was an important part of Jesus' ministry on earth. When our Lord healed people, he always made them completely whole people. Healing and wholeness were therefore synonymous terms from Jesus' perspective. Today's aim, facts, to show how Jesus healed a paralyzed man. Principle, to underscore that God is more concerned about spiritual wholeness than physical well-being. Application, to help students make spiritual concerns a priority in their lives. Illustrating the lesson. The paralyzed man's greatest need was not physical healing, but spiritual healing. God's priority is always our spiritual relationship with Him. Practical points. 1. In the daily course of life, we should look for opportunities to speak God's word to others. Mark 2, 1 through 2. 2. Our faith should not be shaken by any obstacle, verses 3 through 4. 3. Faith itself is not an action, but it is always seen in our actions, verse 5. 4. Spiritual truth cannot be grasped by spiritually dead. Mark 2, 6 through 7, 1 Corinthians 2, 14. 5. We can fool people, but all our thoughts and motives are known by the Lord. Mark 2, 8 through 9. 6. Critics have no answer for lives that have been changed by the Lord. Verses 10 through 12. Golden text. But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. He saith to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise and take up thy bed, and go thy way into thine house. Mark 2, 10 through 11. Today we have two lesson outlines. The first is a physical need, Mark 2, 1 through 5. The second is a complete healing, Mark 2, 6 through 12. Introduction. Persistence in spiritual matters pay off. When Henry B. Jenkins was working with Billy Graham on Billy's autobiography, he asked him, how do you maintain your own spiritual disciplines? Billy responded, we are told to do two things, to pray without ceasing and search the scriptures daily. After hearing him talk about his prayer life, Jennings asked Billy, how about searching the scriptures? What form does that take? Wherever I am in the world, I put my Bible where I can see it during the course of the day, Graham replied. If I'm in a hotel room, I open it and put it on the bed. If I'm in my office, I open it and put it on the edge of my desk. If I'm at home, I put it someplace where I'm going to see it frequently. Anytime I notice that open Bible, I stop and read a verse or two, a chapter or two, or I read for an hour or two. This is not for sermon preparation. It's just for my own edification. It's my spiritual food. A physical need. Mark 2, 1. And again he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was noised that he was in the house. Verse 2. And straightway many were gathered together, insomuch that there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door. And he preached the word unto them. Verse 3. And they come unto him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was born of 4. Verse 4. And when they could not come nigh unto him for the press, they uncovered the roof where he was. And when they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. Verse 5. When Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. Jesus' popularity. Mark 2, 1 through 2. A good example of persistence is recorded for us in this biblical incident. It was the persistence of four friends who helped a man to get to Jesus for healing. Jesus had recently returned from a Galilean tour, 139, to Capernaum. This time he was not in a synagogue, but in a house, probably the house in which he himself was staying. It did not take long for word to get around town that he was home, and the crowds began to gather immediately. Jewish custom allowed uninvited people to come into a home for special events, so the house was soon filled to capacity and a large crowd stood outside. Luke gives the added detail that there were Pharisees and teachers of the law in the crowd, and that they had come from every town in Galilee and Judea and from the capital city of Jerusalem, 517. Jesus' reputation had spread far and wide, and after hearing so much about him, the religious leaders felt it was their duty to investigate his teachings. Instead of resenting the presence of so many people, Jesus was delighted to have them and to have the opportunity to preach God's message to them. He knew that he spoke to a mixed group. Some were there with longing hearts, hoping to be encouraged with spiritual truths. Others were there with critical attitudes. The religious leaders, for the most part, were not genuinely interested in his message. They were feeling threatened by his growing popularity and were incensed that he was exposing their true character. This is Mark's first account of a growing antagonism and organized opposition to Jesus from the religious leaders of Israel. It did not take long for a clear distinction to arise. Jesus was filled with integrity and truth, while they were full of hypocrisy and pretended piety. Friends' determination, Mark 2, 3 through 4. Since the paralytic in this incident was carried by four men, it is possible he was a quadriplegic. It is obvious that they brought him specifically for the purpose of being healed. Upon arrival, they realized from the crowd standing around outside the door that there was no way they could reach Jesus in the normal fashion. They would not be able to get through such a crowd carrying a stretcher without being terribly rude and obnoxious, and yet they were determined. Most of the homes in Israel had flat roofs on which the people sat in the cool of the evening or slept during hot weather. An external stairway led up to the roof, which was probably made of slabs of dried clay spread over supporting beams that stretched from wall to wall. A layer of wet clay might then have been spread over the entire area to make it waterproof. It was apparently this type of roof to which the paralytic's friends took him, and in which they created an opening by removing some of the clay slabs. In order to understand the persistence of this man's friends, we need to imagine all the events that took place that day. As the people crowded into the home and stood many deep around the front door, no doubt there was much craning of necks as each person tried to get a glimpse of Jesus. Those nearby could hear his voice, while those on the perimeters may have strained to hear some of his preaching. All at once there was a disturbance from behind them as four men approached carrying another on a stretcher. Those standing outside must have wondered as they watched the men ascend the stairway to the roof. Soon all eyes inside the house stared upward as noise came from above. Jesus no doubt paused in his preaching and looked upward with them. A hole soon emerged in the roof and gradually became larger. After it was enlarged, a stretcher descended, perhaps on ropes, into the room. Comments and smirks may have passed quickly from person to person as they witnessed this audacious act of determination. They realized immediately that someone needed healing. Paralytic's forgiveness, Mark 2:5. Imagine the silence that momentarily prevailed as everyone in the room watched to see how Jesus was going to respond to this intrusion. Would he resent it? Would he ignore the man and simply go on preaching? Would he scold the four men and tell them to remove the intruding person? Surely such an entrance was a rude interpretation and should not be tolerated, at least. This is what some of those present would have thought, for they themselves would have resented such an intrusion into their lives. Mark gives us a peek into the mind of Jesus at this moment, explaining that he observed the faith of these men who apparently believed he was the Messiah. When they heard Jesus was in town, they probably became very excited at the prospect of a healing. Their initial inability to get close to Jesus was not going to stop them when they were so certain he could heal the one who was paralyzed. Jesus knew this was in their hearts, and it was to that faith that he responded, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." It was a common belief in Israel that every disease or physical impairment was the result of sin in that person's life. While all sickness and suffering is a result of sin in the world, not every instance of suffering is the result of one's personal sin. John 9:2-3. Jesus did not suggest that this man's situation was caused by his sin, but he did recognize the man's need for forgiveness. He also recognized the man's faith. Jesus knew he had a repentant heart and wanted to be right with God as well as healed of his disease. Jesus' words were a response to the man's trusting heart, and he became a forgiven man. Jesus also intended to reveal significant spiritual truth in the way he handled the situation. A complete healing, verse 6. But there were certain of the scribes sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, verse 7. Why does this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? Verse 8. And immediately, when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they so reasoned within themselves, he said unto them, Why reason ye these things in your hearts? Verse 9. Whether it is easier to say to the sick of the palsy, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, Arise and take up thy bed and walk. Verse 10. But that ye may know that the Son of Man have power on earth to forgive sins, he saith to the sick of the palsy. Verse 11. I saith unto thee, Arise and take up thy bed and go thy way into thine house. Verse 12. And immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went forth before them all, insomuch that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, We never saw it on this fashion. Pious criticism, verse Mark 2:6-7. The religious leaders reacted in their minds immediately, accusing Jesus of blasphemy. Mark describes them as sitting there reasoning in their hearts. No one spoke his thoughts, but it is certain that all the religious leaders were contemplating the same thing. Since they knew that only God could forgive sins, they heard Jesus' words of forgiveness as a claim of equality with God. Rabbinical theology taught that all physical infirmity was a sign of divine displeasure and came as a punishment from God for specific sin. Since God was the one displeased with sin and the one who, according to the rabbis, had punished the paralytic because of sin, only God could forgive sin. Christ was then claiming the prerogatives that belonged to God. The law forbade anyone from claiming the prerogatives of God, with death being the punishment for doing so, Leviticus 24:16. We noted earlier that this is Mark's first recorded incident of organized opposition to Jesus. It marked the beginning of a controversy that would not end short of Christ's death. The religious leaders refused to believe his words and completely rejected him. It is ironic that at the same time, multitudes of the common people were flocking to Jesus, hopeful that their Messiah had finally come. Pointed question, Mark 2:8-9. It must have come as a shock to the religious leaders when Jesus revealed that he knew their thoughts. The phrase perceived in his spirit indicates a supernatural knowledge made known to Jesus by his Father. Although Jesus' human mind operated under natural human limitations, Hebrews 2:17, Mark 13:32, the Father made known to him everything necessary for his earthly ministry, John 5:19-20. When he questioned the religious leaders, they were unprepared to give a response. In fact, he did not give them an opportunity for a response, but continued with a very pointed question. It left them no room for argument. Jesus' question was whether it is easier to say, "Thy sins be forgiven thee," or "Arise and take up thy bed and walk," Mark 2:9. The answer is simple. There is no visible proof of the former. It is easy to speak forgiveness because forgiveness takes place in a person's heart and cannot be physically verified. It is quite another thing to command someone who is paralyzed to get up and walk, because it immediately be evident that he either can or cannot do so. If he cannot, the one giving the command will be exposed as a fraud. The religious leaders were critical of Jesus because of his statement to the man that his sins were forgiven. Jesus responded by setting up a situation in which he could prove that he did indeed have the power to forgive sins. He was not simply saying something that he could not prove. He was doing something that truly God alone can do, namely forgive people their sins. The religious leaders were not about to accept the fact that he had the authority to forgive sins, but what Jesus did next proved otherwise. Powerful evidence, Mark 2:10-11. In his next statement, Jesus put everything in the open. "But that ye may know that the Son of Man have power on earth to forgive sins." The scribes and the Pharisees knew that only God can forgive sins, and they were not going to accept that Jesus was divine. So Jesus determined to demonstrate his authority to do what only God can do. What he was about to do would leave them without argument and discredit them before the people. Jesus often referred to himself as the Son of Man. Mark used this title 14 times in his book. In every instance, Jesus was referring to himself. It is a messianic title that combines the ideas of heavenly glory and earthly suffering. Daniel 7:13 is one Old Testament passage that clearly refers to the Son of Man as a divine figure. "I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him." Daniel saw the Son standing in front of the Father, referred to as the Ancient of Days. The next verse describes the power, authority, and dominion given to him in an eternal kingdom never to be destroyed. Jesus' command to the paralyzed man was, "Arise and take up thy bed and go thy way into thine house," Mark 2:11. This was to be a complete and permanent cure, not a sideshow for entertainment. From that day on, people would be able to point to this man as proof that Jesus did indeed have the authority to forgive sins, for he proved it in the accompanying act of physical healing. Praise-filled amazement, Mark 2:12. The scribes thought they had Jesus pinned down, but their accusation of blaspheming had only served to emphasize the justification of Jesus of his right to forgive sins as his subsequent declaration of his divinity. His miracle made it unnecessary for him to refute the scribes further. He had now met his enemies and had gained over them a signal victory. Jesus' claim was verified even as the words left his mouth. The man responded immediately. There was no hesitation, for the miracle was instantaneous. Does not the power of the word of Christ assure us of the power of God today? When Jesus merely spoke, the man did exactly what he said. He got up, picked up his bed, and left to go home, walking strongly all the way there. The relief was no doubt written all over his face as his countenance glowed with joy. The effect on the people present was evident. They had never observed such a display of power before. It was obvious that this was not a staged demonstration of magic or false healing. The unexpected incident had occurred before their eyes and left them staring at one another in amazement. It caused them to think of Jesus, wanted them to think, for they glorified God because of what they had seen. The paralyzed man was made completely whole. God does not always provide immediate healing, but he will always heal spiritually those who come to him in faith and repentance. And even our physical ailments will be healed when he raises us up in the new heavens and new earth. Revelations 21:4. Questions. 1. Where was Jesus at the time of this incident? 2. Why were there so many people in the house where Jesus was? 3. Which of Jesus' critics were present and listening to him? 4. What happened that interrupted Jesus' teaching? 5. What was so shocking about Jesus' first words to the paralytic? 6. What was the reaction of the religious leaders to Jesus' words? 7. What was it about Jesus' statement that upset the leaders? 8. What did Jesus call himself, and what did his title convey? 9. What did Jesus prove by healing the paralytic? 10. How did the people respond to the miracle? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, May 5th, 2024. Thank you for listening. God bless.